The clinking of crystal glasses and soft murmurs of high society filled the lavish dining room. Everything gleamed: silver cutlery, polished floors, the perfect smiles of guests dressed in elegance. It was a place built on appearances, where reputation sat taller than truth. But that illusion shattered the moment the doors opened and an older man walked in, his boots worn, jacket faded, and posture proud, despite the years etched into his skin. He didn't belong, at least not by the restaurant standards. And before he could take a single step forward, the head waiter moved swiftly toward him, eyes filled with disdain. Without even asking the man's name, the waiter gestured harshly toward the door, his voice hushed but laced with venom. "Sir, you're making our guests uncomfortable. This isn't the place for people like you." There was no room for dignity in that moment, just humiliation. The veteran stood frozen, not from shame, but from shock. He had faced battles most men wouldn't survive, had seen comrades fall, had given everything he had for the very country that now turned its back on him in silence. And yet, here he was, cast aside like a stain on fine linen. Around them, diners watched, some pretending not to see, others whispering behind napkins. No one stood. No one spoke. The waiter, emboldened by the silence, reached for the man's arm to guide him out. And that's when it happened. A voice from the back of the room rang out, sharp and unmistakable. "Take your hand off him." The entire restaurant turned as one. The waiter froze, because the person who had just spoken wasn't a guest. He wasn't just any onlooker. He was someone powerful, someone whose presence demanded respect. The veteran turned his head slowly, uncertain, his eyes locking with the figure now striding across the marble floor. There was recognition in his expression, deep, stunned recognition, because the man approaching him wasn't just a stranger. He was someone the veteran had once saved, on a battlefield, long ago, someone who owed him more than gratitude, someone who had never forgotten. And in that instant, everything changed. The silence of the room cracked under the weight of truth. Eyes widened, mouths closed, because in a world obsessed with appearances, they had just witnessed something real: honor walking through the door in old boots. And the man who'd been cast out was about to remind them all what true worth really looked like. The room fell into a stunned silence as the man made his way toward the veteran. His footsteps echoed on the marble, slow and deliberate. He wore a tailored suit, the kind that whispered power without shouting it, and his face, though older now, still carried the sharp features of someone who had faced death and survived. The waiter stepped back instinctively, his posture shifting from superiority to confusion. "Sir, I didn't realize," he began, but the suited man raised a hand. "You didn't ask." The veteran stood tall, shoulders back, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. It had been years since he'd seen that face, years since that war zone, that explosion, that moment where everything went black. And yet, here it was again, not in a foxhole, but in a chandelier-lit room filled with polished lies. "I know you," the suited man said, his voice low. "You carried me. I was half dead. You refused to leave me." People around them began to murmur. Who was this man? Why did he speak with such reverence? Even the maitre d', who had remained proudly uninvolved until now, took a cautious step forward. But no one interrupted, because in that moment, status and wealth bowed to something greater: memory, sacrifice, and truth. The suited man turned to the guests. "This man," he said, motioning to the veteran, "deserves more respect than anyone in this room." The waiter swallowed hard, face flushed with embarrassment. He stepped back, suddenly unsure where to stand. "I had no idea," he muttered. "I thought he was—" But he couldn't finish. The words hung in the air like an unfinished accusation, too cruel to be voiced, too late to be retracted, because the truth had already taken root. The suited man turned back to the veteran. "Come with me," he said gently. "You're not just welcome here. You're my guest." And as they walked side by side toward the finest table in the room, eyes followed them with quiet awe, not because of the suit, but because of the man beside him, aged, wounded, invisible only moments ago, and now, undeniable. They sat together at the center of the restaurant, a place usually reserved for VIPs and celebrities. Yet tonight, the spotlight belonged to someone who had spent most of his life avoiding it. The veteran removed his cap and laid it gently on the table, revealing silver hair and a scar that ran just above his temple. The other man ordered for both of them, his voice calm, composed, and filled with a reverence that made the waiter tremble as he wrote it down. As the food was being prepared, whispers rippled across the room. Some guests avoided eye contact, ashamed of their earlier silence. Others leaned in closer, desperate to know more. The tension in the air wasn't hostile, it was humbling, because the story that was unfolding wasn't one of revenge or status. It was a quiet reckoning, the kind of moment that strips away luxury and exposes the soul beneath. "I never got to thank you," the suited man said, breaking the silence. "You dragged me out of that wreckage. You were wounded, bleeding, but you still carried me. I should have died that night, but you didn't let me." The veteran didn't respond right away. He stared down at the table, as if searching for words buried deep under years of silence. "I wasn't about to leave a brother behind," he finally said. "We made a promise." There was a pause, thick with emotion. "I've spent the last 20 years building this business," the man continued. "But I built it on your shoulders, whether I admitted it or not. Every step forward I took, I owed to you." The veteran looked up, his eyes sharper now. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "You lived. That's enough." But the suited man shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "You gave me more than a second chance. You gave me a future. And tonight, it's time the world sees the man behind that gift." Around them, eyes glistened, not from pity, but from reverence, because they weren't watching a man being honored. They were watching a forgotten hero finally being seen. The waiter returned with their drinks, hands slightly trembling as he placed the glasses on the table. He didn't meet the veteran's eyes, not out of indifference, but shame. "Sir," he said, voice barely audible, "I'm sorry for the way I treated you earlier." The veteran looked at him, not with anger, but with something far more disarming. Calm. "You saw what you expected," he replied. "I've lived long enough to understand that kind of glance." The waiter's throat tightened. Still, it was wrong. The veteran nodded. "Yes, but now you know, and that's the beginning of something better, isn't it?" The words weren't condescending. They were redemptive. They didn't excuse, but they invited change. And that was a lesson no luxury restaurant could teach. At the nearby tables, conversations had quieted. Phones were tucked away. The moment had grown larger than the room itself, stretching beyond the linen-draped tables into something more human. Even those who once whispered behind menus now listened intently, as if bearing witness to something sacred. Because deep down, everyone understood what had just happened. Grace had been extended by the one who least needed to offer it. The suited man leaned in slightly, voice softer now. "You never looked for recognition, did you?" he asked. "You served, disappeared, and let the world move on." The veteran's eyes stared into his glass. "I didn't serve for recognition. I served because I believed people were worth protecting. That includes the ones who forget." There was a long pause before the suited man replied. "Then let me remember. Let all of us remember. Starting now." He turned to the waiter and nodded. "Bring us your finest meal. And tell the kitchen, it's not for me. It's for him." The waiter nodded and turned, but the weight of that request settled into the room like a benediction. The food arrived minutes later, placed gently on the table with more reverence than formality. The veteran looked at the plate in front of him, and for a moment, he hesitated. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because this was the first time in years he'd been treated as if he belonged. "This is too much," he murmured. But the suited man shook his head gently. "It's not enough." They began to eat, and slowly, a kind of ease returned to the veteran's face. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if every bite contained something unfamiliar, dignity. Across the table, his old comrade watched, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He had seen this man crawl through dirt, drag wounded soldiers across fire, stand between bullets and breath. Now, he watched him simply taste good food in peace. And somehow, that felt just as heroic. At a corner table, a young boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Who is that man?" The father leaned in and replied, "Someone we should never have forgotten." The boy's eyes widened, and in that moment, a seed was planted, not of guilt, but of reverence. A quiet promise that not all heroes wear medals on their chest. Some carry their valor in their silence. Meanwhile, the veteran looked around, not with pride, not with resentment, but with curiosity. For years he had walked through crowds unseen, just another old man with tired shoes. But tonight, eyes met his, not with discomfort, but with gratitude. For a lifetime of being overlooked, he was finally being acknowledged. And somehow, that was more nourishing than anything on his plate. "I never thought I'd come back to a place like this," the veteran said softly. "And I never thought it would feel like coming home." The suited man nodded, eyes bright. "Maybe that's what we've all forgotten. That a home isn't about who can afford it. It's about who's earned it." The clatter of plates and the soft hum of voices seemed to blend into a quiet symphony of something new: respect. For the first time in a long while, the veteran didn't feel like a relic. He didn't feel like a burden or a ghost. He felt seen, truly seen. And as he glanced around the room, something in his chest loosened. A weight he didn't even know he was still carrying began to lift. The suited man leaned forward slightly, setting down his glass. "After the war," he said, "I promised myself that if I ever made it, really made it, I would find you. I didn't know your name then, just your face. But I never forgot what you did for me." The veteran looked at him, surprised. "And yet I'm the one who walked in here like a beggar," he said, not bitterly, but honestly. "Life's strange like that." "Strange," the man echoed. "And cruel, sometimes, but also redemptive." He hesitated, then reached into his coat and pulled out a folded photograph, creased from years of being handled. He placed it on the table and slid it across. "Do you remember this?" The veteran's hand trembled as he unfolded the picture. Two men, covered in dust and blood, one carrying the other. It was them. He stared at the image in silence, his eyes glassy. "I didn't know anyone took this," he whispered. "I didn't even think we'd both survive that day." The suited man smiled. "Neither did I. But you didn't let that stop you. You dragged me out with a shattered shoulder and half your ribs broken. You were more than a soldier that day. You were a reason someone else got to live." The photograph rested between them like a relic from another world. And in a way it was. It reminded them not only of what had been lost, but of what had been carried through the fire and delivered into this very moment. Two lives, once bonded by war, now reunited by fate, and a door that dared to swing open when the world wanted it shut. The veteran ran a hand across the photograph again, as if confirming its reality with touch alone. "I used to think about that day," he said quietly, "not because of what I did, but because of what I couldn't do. There were others younger, stronger. I couldn't save them all." His voice faltered. "And sometimes I wondered if saving you was enough." The suited man's expression turned solemn. "You saved more than a life that day," he said. "You saved the future of my family, my daughter, my business, the lives I've touched since. All of it came from that moment, from your decision to turn back instead of running forward. You didn't just save me, you multiplied hope." At a nearby table, a couple who had watched the scene from the beginning stood up and quietly approached. The woman spoke first, her voice full of emotion. "I'm sorry for interrupting," she said, "but thank you for your service, for your sacrifice. We see you." The veteran blinked, startled by the directness of the sentiment. "I thank you," he replied, his voice cracking just slightly. The couple returned to their table, but something shifted after that. One by one, people stood, not clapping, not making a show, but approaching quietly. Some shook his hand, some nodded. One elderly man simply placed a coin from his own time in the service beside the photograph and walked away. It wasn't a celebration. It was recognition, and it was long overdue. The veteran looked around, overwhelmed. He had walked into the restaurant expecting rejection, bracing for humiliation. And yet, somehow, he had found honor. Not because he demanded it, but because, at last, the world had remembered to look beneath the surface and found a hero waiting to be seen. The photograph remained on the table, a silent witness to the shift in atmosphere that had overtaken the restaurant. For so long, the veteran had been accustomed to invisibility, the kind that wraps around you like fog until you begin to doubt you were ever really there. But tonight that fog had lifted, not because he asked for acknowledgement, but because someone else demanded the world stop and see. The suited man leaned back in his chair, watching the small moments unfold, the subtle bows, the hands over hearts, the nods of silent understanding from strangers. "You see," he said softly, "you haven't been forgotten. You were just waiting for the right door to open again. The veteran smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and humility playing across his features. Funny how it took being kicked out to finally be invited in. That line made the man laugh, quietly, but with a sincerity that warmed the table. Sometimes it takes a little injustice to wake people up, the kind that forces them to ask who they've become and who they've ignored along the way. He paused. I've spent years trying to honor you privately. Donations, memorials, ceremonies. But none of that compares to this. The veteran looked up, curiosity in his eyes. Why this? He asked. Why does this matter more than all of that? The suited man gestured around the room. Because this isn't scripted. It's real. It's now. It's people seeing you, not as a symbol, but as a man who was here the whole time. And when truth shows up unannounced, it humbles everyone. The veteran lowered his gaze to the photo once more. I didn't think my story was worth remembering, he admitted. But maybe it's not about the story. Maybe it's about who hears it and what they do with it. He closed his eyes briefly. If tonight reminds someone to look twice, then that's enough. The restaurant was no longer a place of cold formality. It had become a space of reverence. Guests who once avoided eye contact were now leaning in, not with pity, but with newfound respect. A young server, clearly nervous, approached the table and gently set down a small box wrapped in black velvet. Sir, she said to the veteran, the chef asked me to give this to you. He said no meal tonight would be complete without this. The veteran opened the box slowly. Inside was a silver pin shaped like an eagle, wings stretched wide, perched on a branch of olive and arrows. He recognized it immediately. It was the restaurant's highest honor, rarely given, usually reserved for dignitaries or retiring staff. He looked at the suited man. I don't work here, he said, bewildered. No, the man replied. But you've worked harder, sacrificed more, and inspired deeper than anyone who ever has. This isn't about employment. It's about value. The veteran's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pin. He held it delicately, like something too sacred to belong to him. I never needed medals, he said. But this means something. The chef himself came out from the back, his apron still dusted with flour, and nodded respectfully. Sir, it's not just an honor to cook for you. It's a privilege to have you in this space. This pin doesn't elevate you. It simply reflects what's already true. The veteran stood, unsure of what to say, and shook the man's hand firmly. When he sat back down, he looked at the suited man and whispered, I didn't come here for any of this. I just wanted dinner. His companion smiled. And you got something even better, he said. Not just food, not even recognition. You got your story back. And now, the world's listening. The veteran turned the pin over in his hand once more, watching the light catch its polished surface. But it wasn't the silver that moved him. It was what it symbolized. A life that, until now, had gone unnoticed by the very society he'd helped protect. You know, he said slowly, for years, I walked into rooms and felt like I didn't exist. Not because people were cruel, just busy, distracted, too caught up in their own reflections to see someone standing in the corner. The suited man leaned forward, listening with the attentiveness of a student at the feet of a master. I think it takes a moment like this to realize how many people we walk past every day, people with stories bigger than ours, who've just never had the chance to speak them out loud. He paused. But you being here, it's changed the room. A hush had settled over the tables again. The weight of the evening wasn't heavy. It was sacred. Even the waitstaff, who had once treated the man like an outsider, now moved with careful grace around him, as though serving not just a customer, but a chapter of history they'd almost ignored. It was the kind of reverence usually reserved for monuments. Yet here, it lived and breathed in front of them. The veteran's voice dropped. I never wanted to be a monument, he said. I wanted to be remembered by the people I fought for. That's it. Just remembered. He looked around the room, eyes scanning faces that now looked back with gratitude, not judgment. And for the first time in a long while, I don't feel forgotten. The suited man smiled gently. You shouldn't have had to wait this long, he said. But sometimes, the deepest honor isn't found in ceremony. It's found in a room full of strangers who finally see you. The veteran nodded, his eyes misted but proud. Then let them see everything. Not just the uniform, the scars, the cost, the courage it takes just to keep walking. The moment had become more than a personal reunion. It had become a mirror held up to everyone in the room. Some diners quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Others stared down at their plates, their meals forgotten, wrestling with a quiet awakening. The veteran, without intention, had reminded them all of something they'd lost touch with: humility. Across the restaurant, a woman stood up, older, with silver hair and eyes full of memory. She approached slowly and placed her hand over her heart. "My brother didn't come home," she said softly. "But I think, if he had, he might have looked like you. Thank you for everything." The veteran took her hand in both of his. "Then I carry him with me too," he said, voice low and steady. When she returned to her seat, the veteran turned to the man beside him. "I thought this night would end differently," he said. "That I'd be outside in the cold again, wondering where I went wrong." He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "Instead, I'm surrounded by warmth I didn't expect, and kindness I thought I'd forgotten." "That's the thing about dignity," the man replied. "It doesn't disappear. It waits, quietly, until someone has the courage to make space for it again. You never lost yours. We just need to catch up to it." His voice carried the weight of years, but also hope. And as the veteran sat back, his pen glinting under the light, his hands no longer trembled. He wasn't a guest anymore. He wasn't a stranger. He was the anchor of the room, the reminder that beneath polished tables and crystal chandeliers, true greatness often enters quietly and only asks to be heard. As the veteran leaned into the back of his chair, a soft calm settled into his frame, something deeper than contentment. It was the calm of someone who had waited decades for the world to catch its breath and finally look him in the eye. The clamor of earlier judgments had vanished, replaced by the quiet dignity of recognition. He wasn't just part of the room now. He was its center, its gravity. The suited man lifted his glass, not in a showy toast, but in a quiet gesture of reverence. "To the ones who never asked for praise," he said, "and to the rare moments when the world gets a second chance to do right." Across the room, others raised their glasses too, not because they were asked, but because they felt compelled. This wasn't about a man anymore. It was about all the stories like his that had gone unheard. The veteran looked up, surprised at first by the gesture, then visibly moved. His voice was steady, but tinged with emotion. "I've been to war," he said. "I've faced enemies I could see, and battles I could name. But the hardest fight has always been silence. The kind that follows you home and convinces you that your story no longer matters." The room remained still. No one dared to interrupt the kind of truth that reshapes people. "I used to sit in diners alone," the veteran continued. "Not because I didn't want company, but because I forgot what it felt like to belong. Tonight reminded me." His eyes found the suited man's. "And it's because of you." The man shook his head gently. "No," he said. "It's because of you. I just held the door open. You walked through it. A beat passed, and you brought all of us with you." The evening had taken on a new kind of silence. Not the awkward hush of before, but the stillness that comes when everyone knows they've witnessed something profound. No music played. No plates clinked. It was the kind of atmosphere where words felt sacred, and even breath seemed quieter, more intentional. A moment suspended in time. A young couple sitting nearby asked if they could approach. When the veteran nodded, they walked over, their newborn cradled in the father's arms. "We wanted our son's first dinner out to be in a place that mattered," the woman said. "We didn't expect this. But now we'll tell him, someday, about the man he shared a room with tonight." She gently touched the veteran's shoulder. "You're part of our story now." The veteran, visibly touched, looked at the child and smiled. A soft, paternal smile that held decades of quiet strength. "Then raise him to be kind," he said. "Raise him to see the unseen. That's how stories like mine stop being rare." The father nodded, his eyes glossy. "We will." As they returned to their table, the suited man looked down at the photo still resting beside the veteran's plate. "Strange how one picture can hold so much," he murmured. "Pain, hope, legacy, and now redemption." He glanced up. "Would you let me frame it in the restaurant's main hall?" The veteran hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Not for me," he said, "but for the ones who never got to walk in here. Let them be seen through me." His words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They lingered in the air like the final note of a symphony that refuses to fade. The suited man gently lifted the photograph, holding it with the same care one might offer to a sacred artifact. Then that's what we'll do, he said. Not as decoration, not as sentimentality, but as a living reminder. He signaled to the manager, who approached with quiet reverence, nodding as he received the photo. Let it hang where everyone can see it, the man added, at eye level. The manager responded with a soft, of course, but even his voice carried emotion. For a place built on exclusivity, tonight had opened its doors to something far more lasting. Truth. The kind of truth that doesn't ask who you are now, but remembers who you've been, and what you carried so others wouldn't have to. The veteran looked around once more, taking in the room that had so quickly transformed from hostile to holy. His gaze lingered on the smallest things. A couple holding hands, a server folding a napkin slowly, a candle flickering beside a half-finished dessert. These things, so ordinary, had always continued without him. But tonight, they had paused for him, and that, in itself, was a kind of miracle. You know, he said quietly, I used to think that survival meant silence. That coming back alive was reward enough. But tonight showed me something else. Survival means telling the story, so the silence doesn't win. His eyes found the man across from him. You gave my silence a voice. The man nodded slowly. And you gave my success a soul, he said. Everything I've built means more now, because it stands on a foundation of sacrifice. Yours. His hand reached out across the table again, not for formality, but for grounding. I don't want a night to be the end of something. I want it to be the beginning. As the final courses were cleared, no one rushed to leave. The restaurant, normally efficient and hurried, had surrendered to the moment. There was a quiet agreement among all present. This was more than a dinner. It was a reckoning, a return, a rewriting of what dignity looks like in a world that forgets too easily. The veteran leaned back, a hint of exhaustion in his posture, but it wasn't the kind that wears down. It was the kind that comes after something sacred has been set down. A burden carried too long, finally laid at someone else's feet. I didn't expect kindness here, he said. I came in because I was tired, hungry. Not because I believed the world would meet me with grace. And yet it did, the suited man replied. Or maybe you pulled it out of the world. Made people remember the better parts of themselves. He smiled slightly. That's what real heroes do. They don't command the spotlight. They restore it. Quietly. The veteran turned to look at the people around them. Some were talking softly. Some just watched. A few were taking deep breaths, like they were finally realizing what they'd almost missed. Maybe next time I walk into a place like this, he said, they won't wait for someone important to speak up. Maybe they'll stand up on their own. Then let's make sure there's a next time, the man said. Not just for you. For others like you. For anyone who's been overlooked, underestimated, pushed to the edges of a world they helped build. His words were firm, not performative. There was resolve in his voice. The veteran nodded, not with fanfare, but with finality. Then let this be the first table, he said. The first of many. And though no music played, and no curtain fell, the moment carried the weight of something finished, yet just beginning. The rain had begun to fall gently outside, streaking the large glass windows with slow-moving droplets that caught the golden light from within. The veteran noticed it, his eyes following the motion with quiet thought. Funny, he said, how rain used to mean danger. On the battlefield, it meant everything was about to get harder, mud, visibility, cold. But now, it feels like a blessing, a soft ending. The suited man followed his gaze. Maybe it's not an ending, he said. Maybe it's the kind of rain that washes something away. The kind that makes the air clearer, the soul lighter. He looked back at the veteran. That's what tonight feels like to me. Not closure, cleansing. Their empty plates had been cleared long ago, but no one asked them to leave. The staff moved around them with a reverence that didn't need instructions. Even the maitre d', who had once looked past the veteran without a second glance, now stood at a respectful distance, silently watching a transformation unfold that no reservation list could predict. Most of my life, the veteran said after a pause, I never asked for anything. I figured quiet was safer than disappointment. He looked at the suited man. But if I'm being honest, tonight gave me something I didn't even know I was still looking for. His voice softened. A place to sit. A place to belong. The man's reply came without hesitation. Then it's yours, he said. This table. This place. Anytime. You walk through those doors again, and they open wider because of who you are. Not because of who's behind you, but because you already carry everything that matters. The veteran gave a slow, deep nod, his fingers brushing the edge of the table like someone memorizing the grain of something they had once believed was beyond reach. He didn't need more food. He didn't need a medal. What he had now was far greater, a return to dignity. Not the kind granted by uniforms or ceremonies, but the kind reclaimed through truth. Across the room, a boy no older than 10 walked toward him shyly. His parents watched from their table, encouraging him with quiet nods. When he reached the veteran, he held out a drawing, crude but earnest, of a man in boots standing tall in front of an American flag. "Is this you?" the boy asked, voice small but hopeful. The veteran took the drawing gently, his hand shaking just slightly. He looked at it for a long time before replying. "It could be," he said with a kind smile. "Or maybe it's someone just like me. Someone who hoped the world would still remember." He looked the boy in the eyes. "Thank you for helping it too." The boy beamed and ran back to his parents, who mouthed a heartfelt thank you across the room. And in that moment, the veteran felt something he hadn't felt in decades: legacy. Not in the form of statues or speeches, but in the heart of a child who saw him clearly. As he placed the drawing carefully into his coat pocket, he looked once more at the suited man. "You saved me again tonight," he said. "Not from death this time, but from disappearing." The man's expression softened. "Then I only returned the favor." They smiled, two men bound not by war, but by what had survived it. The veteran adjusted the drawing in his coat pocket, as if placing something fragile into armor. It wasn't the paper that mattered. It was the meaning. Someone had seen him. A child, no less. And in that pure reflection, he recognized a truth he hadn't dared name for years. He still had value. Not for what he once did, but for who he still was. "I used to think my story ended with the war," he said, his voice almost distant, as though speaking to the years themselves. "After that, I just faded. Jobs came and went. People came and went. But nothing stuck. I started to believe I was only important in the middle of chaos." He paused, and when peace came, I didn't know what to do with it. The suited man nodded slowly, his face unreadable but intent. "Peace isn't the absence of war," he said. "It's the beginning of restoration. But no one teaches us how to live in the quiet, do they?" He leaned in slightly. "Tonight, I think you started learning how." The veteran chuckled softly, the sound like gravel softened by rain. "Then it's a lesson worth learning, even if it took me 50 years. His eyes lifted to the high ceiling above, ornate and glowing. "Funny, I've been in bunkers and deserts, but this is the first place in a long time that's made me feel safe." The man raised his glass again, this time not for a toast, but in silent solidarity. "Then let's make peace your new battlefield," he said. "Let's fight for the quiet moments. The ones where nothing explodes, just hearts opening, stories unfolding, people finally listening." The door to the restaurant opened briefly, letting in a gust of wind and the fresh scent of rain. The veteran glanced toward it, eyes reflecting both the past and the present. "There were nights I slept near alleyways," he said, "and every door I passed felt like a reminder that I wasn't welcome. No one needed to say it. I could feel it in the way they didn't look at me." The suited man didn't speak right away. He knew this wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for truth. "And now," he finally asked. The veteran turned back to him, his face softening. "Now, for the first time, I don't feel like I'm standing outside anymore." Their plates had long been cleared. The staff, though moving quietly, kept their distance, allowing the men space to speak freely. It was as if the entire restaurant had agreed. Some meals nourish the body, but others, they restore the soul. "I don't want to leave tonight," the veteran said, voice quiet. "Not because of the food, not because of the people, but because this feeling is rare, and I don't know if I'll find it again." He tapped the table gently. "It's not just wood and polish. It's a place where I was reminded I'm still human." The suited man nodded, emotion rising behind his calm expression. "Then this table is yours," he said, "as long as you need it, whenever you need it." He paused, then added, "And maybe someday, someone else will sit here, another soul the world almost forgot. And when they do, it'll be your story that holds the seat open for them." The veteran's eyes welled with emotion, but not from pain. It was something deeper, recognition, maybe, or the quiet ache that comes when someone finally sees your worth without you having to prove it. You know, he said, I've walked through so many doors that led nowhere. I stopped expecting anything on the other side. But tonight, I walked into a room and left with something I never thought I'd feel again: dignity. The suited man didn't respond right away. He just sat with the words, letting their weight land where it needed to. Then, with a calm breath, he said, dignity was never gone. It was just buried beneath the noise. The world forgets fast, but it remembers even faster when we choose to look again. From across the restaurant, the head chef reappeared, not with fanfare, but with a small wooden plaque in his hands. He approached the table and set it down gently in front of the veteran. Carved into it, in simple lettering, were the words, reserved for those who served. Beneath it, in honor of all who walked in his boots. The room stilled again. The gesture was not loud, not grand, but deeply human. The veteran ran his fingers over the wood. You're putting this on the table? He asked. The chef nodded. Every night, no matter who walks through the door, someone's seat will always be waiting. Because of you. The veteran lowered his head, overcome. It wasn't the plaque that broke him. It was the permanence of the message. A reminder that his story wouldn't disappear the moment he stepped back into the night. It would stay, etched in wood, in memory, in the very grain of a place that had once turned him away. As they prepared to leave, the suited man helped the veteran into his coat, careful with every movement. Not out of obligation, but out of reverence. The rain had eased into a mist, the kind that clung to the air like a blessing. The door opened again, but this time, the chill didn't bite, it welcomed. They stood together at the entrance for a moment, looking back at the table now empty, but no longer forgotten. The plaque rested where the meal had been, catching the soft light from the chandelier above. The space was transformed, not just by words or wood, but by presence, and the story it would now carry, night after night. I'm not sure what comes next, the veteran said, but for the first time, I'm not afraid of tomorrow. His voice was quiet but resolute, as if speaking to the part of himself that had waited decades to be heard. I used to think my best days were behind me. Tonight, I think they might still be ahead. The suited man offered a final handshake, but the veteran pulled him into a quiet, firm embrace. No words, just shared breath, shared history, shared gratitude. When they stepped back, the suited man smiled. Then walk into tomorrow like you walked into that fire. Not because you have to, but because you can. And with that, the door closed gently behind them, not on an ending, but on a legacy. A single night in a fine restaurant had become more than a meal. It had become a reminder that even the most forgotten among us carry the stories that define us. All they need is someone willing to listen. The mist clung to the city as the two men stepped into the night, their footsteps soft on the wet pavement. For a while, they walked in silence, neither rushing the moment nor trying to fill it with empty words. There was something sacred in the stillness, as if the evening itself knew it had become part of something larger than a simple reunion. It had become a turning point, not just for the veteran, but for everyone who had witnessed it. After a few blocks, they stopped beneath a street lamp. Its golden light bathed them gently, a quiet contrast to the fluorescent cold of so many places that had never welcomed the veteran before. He looked up, watching the drops collect on the glass above. There's something about walking with someone who remembers you, he said, that makes you feel like you never really left. The suited man turned to him. You didn't, he replied. You were just waiting for the world to catch up. He paused, searching the older man's face. You carried us. Now, let us carry you for a while. It wasn't pity that drove the words. It was respect. A deep, earned respect that needed no parade, no camera, no applause. The veteran nodded slowly, his lips curving into a faint smile. I think I'm ready to let someone carry part of the weight now. Then, with quiet reflection, he added, funny how we never really need grand gestures. Just someone to say, you matter. That's all it takes. They kept walking, past closed shops and flickering signs, until the city faded behind them, leaving only two men, two stories intertwined by blood, sacrifice, and now, redemption. The veteran no longer looked like someone who had been forgotten. He looked like someone who had been remembered, properly, finally, deeply. Word of the night spread slowly at first, through whispers, retellings, a social post shared by a staff member, accompanied by the image of the empty table and the plaque. But it wasn't the photo that moved people. It was the caption underneath. He came in alone. He left scene. Within hours, the story traveled beyond the walls of the restaurant, reaching homes, phones, and hearts far from that single dining room. Veterans groups began sharing it. Families of those who never returned from war reposted it. Strangers who had never thought twice about the man sitting alone at the next table now paused. Something had shifted. A moment of empathy had rippled outward, waking up a part of the world that had gone numb to quiet sacrifice. The veteran, unaware of the digital echo his presence had created, spent the next day exactly as he always had, rising early, walking the same few blocks to the park bench where he liked to sit. But something was different. A florist had placed a small bouquet there. A schoolteacher had brought her class by to leave thank you cards taped to the bench's back. One note read, "You remind me of my grandfather. I hope he had a hero like you beside him." He read each one slowly, his weathered fingers trembling as he held the folded papers. Not from cold, from something deeper, recognition. And when he looked up and saw people approaching, not to hurry past, but to greet him, he realized his story had been set free, not just to live online, but in hearts, in change, in memory. What had happened in that restaurant was no longer about one night, one man, or one injustice corrected. It was about a shift, a collective remembering, the kind that turns silent stories into sacred legacies and leaves no hero behind. By the following week, the restaurant had changed in ways its founders had never anticipated. The plaque remained at the corner table, untouched and gleaming, but something else had taken root. Patrons began asking to sit near the table, not out of curiosity, but out of reverence. Conversations quieted when guests passed it. Servers spoke about it in hushed tones, as if guarding something sacred. It had become a symbol, not of loss, but of honor reclaimed. One evening, another veteran walked through the door. He hesitated at the entrance, his eyes scanning the room with that familiar look, the one that measured safety before taking another step. But this time, before the hostess could even greet him, another guest stood and gestured to the plaque. "That seat's yours," he said. "Please." The room quieted, not in tension, but in welcome. The man walked slowly to the table, his gait unsteady, not from age, but from the years that had bent his spirit. As he sat, he reached out and traced the engraving with calloused fingers. For a long moment, he just breathed. Then he looked around and whispered, "Thank you." It was more than gratitude. It was the sigh of someone who had finally found shelter after too many storms. Back in his usual park, the original veteran heard about it days later from a young man who'd seen the moment online. "Sir, people are sitting at that table now because of you," he said, eyes wide with awe. "You didn't just change one night. You changed every night after that." The veteran smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening. "I didn't mean to change anything," he replied. "I just wanted dinner." But what he had started was more than a moment. It was a movement, a quiet revolution of recognition. One seat, one story, one soul at a time. The restaurant began receiving letters. Some were handwritten, some typed, others drawn in crayons by children too young to understand war, but old enough to recognize bravery. One letter, sent by a woman in her 90s, simply said, "My husband never made it home. Thank you for giving someone else's husband a seat at the table he missed." That note now hung in the kitchen, framed above the staff's meal prep station. The veteran continued his routine, coffee at dawn, park bench by mid-morning, long walks in the afternoon. But something had shifted in his posture. It was subtle, but clear. He no longer walked with the invisible weight of shame. He moved like a man who knew his story mattered. And not because someone gave him permission, but because someone finally listened. One afternoon, a woman approached him in the park. She held a sketch pad and asked if she could draw him. "I've read your story," she said, "but I want to remember your face, your eyes." He chuckled. "They've seen too much." But he agreed. She sat across from him for an hour, drawing in silence. When she showed him the finished piece, he nodded, eyes misting. "That's not just my face," he said. "That's every man who ever walked home and wondered if he was still welcome." The drawing was later displayed in the restaurant, near the plaque. Below it, a brass plate read, "He walked in alone. He left carrying us all." That table, once just wood and polish, had become a memorial, not of death, but of endurance, not of war, but of return. And through one man's quiet bravery, the world had been reminded of something it had nearly forgotten, that some of the greatest stories ever lived are the ones we almost didn't hear. Months passed, and the seasons changed, but the legacy of that night only deepened. The restaurant became more than a fine dining spot. It became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans from other cities visited just to see the table. Some left small tokens behind, a dog tag, a folded note, a patch from a uniform long since retired. The staff began collecting these offerings with care, preserving them in a glass case near the entrance, now affectionately called the honor wall. But what truly transformed the space wasn't the objects, it was the stories. Families brought their children, not just for meals, but for lessons. "Sit here," they'd say, pointing to the bench beside the honorary table. "This is where real courage Saturday." And with every retelling of the story, the veteran's presence grew stronger, not as a memory, but as a living thread woven through the community. The veteran, for his part, remained humble. He never sought attention, never cashed in on the moment. He still visited the park every morning, still drank his same black coffee at the corner diner. But wherever he went, there were nods, handshakes, and, most powerfully, eyes that no longer looked through him. For the first time in decades, he had a name in the world again. Not just sir, not just that man, but someone who made us all better. One quiet evening, the suited man returned to the restaurant alone. He sat at the honorary table, placed his hand gently on the plaque, and closed his eyes. So much had changed since that first night. Yet the chair across from him remained a reminder of the man who had given it meaning. "You didn't come here to be remembered," he whispered, "but we'll remember you anyway." Outside, the city lights glowed softly as rain began to fall once again, just like that first night. But this time, the rain felt like a welcome, a reminder that legacy, once ignited, never fades. It only spreads. The veteran passed away quietly one morning, seated on his favorite bench, the drawings still folded neatly in his coat pocket. The park groundskeeper found him with a peaceful expression on his face, as if he had simply drifted off in the middle of remembering something beautiful. The news spread gently but swiftly, and though he had no family listed in any record, no next of kin, no emergency contact, he was far from alone. Within hours, people gathered, not because they were called, but because they felt drawn. Veterans in uniform, children with flags, waiters and cooks, strangers who had only heard the story once but never forgot it. The restaurant closed for the day. A candle was lit on the honorary table. The seat remained empty. A single rose lay across the plaque. The suited man delivered the eulogy himself. He stood in front of a quiet crowd, holding the photograph they had shared that night so long ago. "He came into my life carrying me out of death," he said, "and left my life showing me how to live. He taught us that dignity doesn't shout. It whispers. It shows up. It stays." The city later declared that table a protected space. It could not be removed, could not be sold, could not be reserved for anyone else. It belonged to them now, to the forgotten, the unseen, the quietly brave. And every night, a fresh plate was placed there, not to be eaten, but to remind the world that some debts are too great to be repaid, only honored. And somewhere, beyond what eyes can see, perhaps the veteran walked through one more door. But this time, no one turned him away. This time, someone stood and said, "We've been waiting for you. The table's already set." In the weeks that followed, letters poured in from across the country. Some from military families, others from people who had simply felt invisible for far too long. One woman wrote, "I was never in a war, but I know what it's like to walk into a room and feel like I don't belong. His story reminded me I do." Another letter came from a young man who had been contemplating giving up. He wrote, "I saw the story online. I saw how people changed, and I thought, maybe I can still change too." The restaurant, though unchanged on the surface, had become something different entirely. It was no longer about the food. It was about the people, about the seat that reminded everyone who walked in that service, sacrifice, and quiet strength do not go unnoticed forever. There were nights when the table was surrounded by strangers who simply wanted to sit in the presence of that legacy. They didn't speak loudly. They didn't need to. They came to remember. One evening, a teenage boy arrived alone. He wore his grandfather's coat, oversized and patched, and stood for a long moment beside the table. Then, with shaky hands, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden toy soldier. He placed it gently beside the plaque and whispered, "He used to tell me stories about someone like you." Then he sat down at the table across from the empty chair and cried, not out of grief, but out of connection. And in that moment, the restaurant staff didn't move. They didn't approach. They didn't interrupt. They let the moment breathe, knowing it wasn't theirs to touch. They had learned something sacred, that some tables are not meant to be cleared. They are meant to be held. Outside, the rain returned again, soft, steady, as if the sky had also learned how to mourn and honor it once. News outlets eventually caught wind of the evolving legacy, calling it the table that remembers. But to those who had been there, truly been present, it wasn't a headline. It was a holy place. Veterans traveled cross-country just to see it. Some sat in silence. Others shared stories they had never said out loud before. Widows brought photos. Children brought hand-drawn thank you cards. And not once did the space lose its meaning. The suited man still visited often. Sometimes he came alone, sometimes with guests. But he never sat in the honorary seat. No one did. That chair remained untouched, eternally offered. It had become more than a chair. It had become a vessel for memory, for unspoken gratitude, for everything the world forgets until someone dares to remember. One night, a woman arrived with a folded flag in her arms. She placed it gently on the table, next to a cup of black coffee. No cream, no sugar, just as the original veteran had liked it. She didn't say much. Only this. He would have loved this. Then she turned, nodded to the staff, and walked out. And in her silence, she left a louder echo than words ever could. That table, now polished daily by hand, was no longer just for veterans. It was for anyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy. It had become a mirror, reminding guests of the humanity sitting next to them, of the people they overlooked, of the weight others carry silently through their days. And as the years passed, it remained untouched by time. Because the story wasn't about the table at all. It was about the man who sat there once and gave everyone else permission to be seen. Time moved forward, but the story of the table remained timeless. Generations began to know it not just through articles or faded photos, but through first-hand retellings, passed down like sacred folklore. School groups visited as part of history lessons. Soldiers, young and old, left notes etched with the names of those they served beside. And on quiet nights, guests would pause before being seated elsewhere, placing their hands on the chair's backrest as if to say, "I see you." The restaurant never franchised. It never remodeled the section where the table stood. No matter how popular the story became, no matter how many journalists or influencers tried to frame it for attention, the staff protected it with unwavering integrity. They understood this wasn't about commerce. It was about character. It wasn't about visibility. It was about vision, the kind that sees beyond uniforms, beyond age, beyond silence. One day, a little girl entered holding her grandfather's hand. She looked up at the plaque, then at the empty chair, then whispered to him, "Is that the hero's seat?" Her grandfather, a stoic man with eyes weathered by decades, knelt beside her and replied, "No, sweetie. That seat is for every hero who never had one." She didn't fully understand, but she nodded and placed a flower beside the plate anyway. Somehow, that gesture meant everything. Even the waitstaff changed how they moved through the room. They carried dishes more carefully. They lowered their voices near the table. Some of them would pause, mid-shift, just to stand in front of it for a moment. No one had told them to do it. They simply knew that in a world that rarely slows down, this place was a reminder to stop, to feel something real. And across all the noise of a growing city, across the bustle and rush of 1,000 busy lives, the story of a man who came in alone and left seen remained, like a soft heartbeat echoing beneath every conversation. Years passed. The city changed. Buildings rose and fell. Faces came and went, but the table stayed. Tourists came expecting a story and left carrying something heavier: responsibility. Not the burden of guilt, but the gift of awareness. The story wasn't just one to admire, it was one to live by. To recognize the quiet heroes around us. To look twice at the people we so often ignore. The restaurant became a symbol, but not because of design or decor. It became sacred because it reminded the world what it means to honor someone before they're gone. And that kind of honoring rippled far beyond those walls. It showed up in buses where someone stood to give a veteran a seat. In hospitals where someone held a trembling hand. In homes where a story, once buried in silence, was finally told. The suited man eventually grew old. One night, he returned to the restaurant with his own grandson, who had heard the tale so many times it had become part of his bones. As they stood before the table, the old man whispered, "This is where everything changed." The boy asked, "For him?" The man nodded slowly. "For all of us." That evening, a new photo was quietly placed beside the original. Not to replace it, but to continue it. It showed the empty chair, the rose, the plaque, and a light from the window pouring across the seat like a blessing. Beneath it, a new line was added to the brass, a place for the forgotten, until they are forgotten no more. And so, through quiet hands, open hearts, and one man's silent walk into a room that tried to turn him away, the world was reminded, dignity doesn't ask for permission. It just needs a place to sit. There are moments in life that don't ask for permission to change us. They simply arrive. Quiet, unassuming. And if we're lucky enough to be paying attention, they remind us that behind every face we overlook is a story we never took the time to hear. This story wasn't about a table or a restaurant or even a single man. It was about recognition, the kind that comes too late for some, and just in time for others. The kind that doesn't erase pain, but reclaims purpose. The veteran walked into that restaurant with nothing but his name and his dignity, weathered, but intact. And what he found wasn't pity or charity, but honor. Not the kind printed on medals or stitched into uniforms, but the kind that lives in the way a room goes quiet when truth enters. The way strangers rise without being asked. The way a nation remembers, even if it's only one person at a time. His presence changed the air around him. It reminded people that greatness often wears boots scuffed by time and silence thick with sacrifice. That sometimes the ones we overlook are the very people who built the world we now enjoy and comfort. And when that chair remained empty, set with care and reverence, it wasn't a symbol of loss. It was a promise that we will not forget again. So as you carry this story with you, ask yourself, who in your life has been quietly fading into the background, unseen, unheard, uninvited? And what would it mean to pull out a chair for them? Not out of guilt, but out of gratitude. Because sometimes the greatest act of heroism isn't what someone did. It's what we choose to do after we hear their story. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect below. Share your thoughts. Tell us who you're honoring. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like this, subscribe, like, and let your voice become part of the memory. Because when we listen, we remember. And when we remember, we heal. One story at a time.